G'day folks, welcome to the Wednesday webcast with Mike. I've been away for a couple of weeks, but it's a pleasure to be back again. And my guest today is the wonderful Rabia Siddique. Rabia has been a friend for a number of years now, and I've had the pleasure of speaking with her at various events and also working on a few projects together. Rabia experienced a significant hostage situation as a military person in Basra back in 2005, and that story made global headlines. Once they got out of the situation, Rabia was pretty much ordered to have a cup of tea and a lie down and never speak of it again, while her colleagues were debriefed formally in due military process and pretty much celebrated as heroes. So she ended up taking the British government to court on the basis of discrimination and won that case, which was a significant milestone. She's experienced many other challenges in life as well, and uses that experience as a platform to speak widely around the world, supporting the voiceless, making huge inroads into significant global change. Rabia, it's a delight to spend some time with you again. How are you?
Such a pleasure. I haven't seen you or spoken to you for such a long time, so I'm thrilled to be sharing this with you. Might not be able to hug you in person, but lovely to be able to chat and see your face. And
indeed, you too. Elbow bumps via the camera are a bit weird.
The COVID bump.
Yeah, that's it. So Rabia, your business, like many, was fairly tied to events and conferences and in-house training and face-to-face kinds of things. So like a lot of us, took a significant hit. How are you traveling just at the minute with regard to adapting to that and recovery from that?
Yeah, life never ceases to teach you lessons, doesn't it? And just when you think you couldn't live through anything, more traumatic, and life couldn't challenge you anymore because you think you've been through the worst, then something else comes around the corner like a freight train. And I know that, no one's really been untouched by this pandemic. I think for me, from my personal experience, Friday the 13th of March, Black Friday, will be the day that I won't forget in a hurry, when this was my 8th year of my business. So after 20 odd years as a lawyer, and then deciding to start up my business where I could serve people in a different way. This year, being year number 8, was supposed to be my record year in terms of the amount of international work that I was doing, and the clients, and the really rich work that I'd been building. And then on Friday the 13th of March, when our Prime Minister made the first announcement about the restrictions and that all gatherings over 100 would cease, I'd say probably 95% of my business disappeared within that 24-hour period. And I'm not ashamed to say that I think I went into free fall. I unraveled. Talk about facing your fears. I everything, all my security and everything that I thought I had worked for was literally evaporating. When you have children and bills and responsibilities, that becomes really frightening, and you feel extremely exposed. And I think that was probably the state I remained in for a good day or two. And then it became pretty clear to me that this was a worldwide, and this was going to be a lengthy phenomenon, and this was just going to change paradigms for everybody. And I was quickly aware of the deep impact it would have on people in ways that I couldn't foresee. And so I pulled myself together, and I reached deeply within myself, and I reached back into my training and reminded myself that actually living through, coping with crises is what I've done all my life. And so this was just another opportunity to rise up and, to walk the talk, to take my own medicine. And so I just asked myself the question, I quietened my mind, and I asked myself the question, how can I serve at this time? And I think being able to ask that question and repeatedly ask myself that question, sometimes every day, has served me well and helped me through this. The journey for me during this period has been that I came to realize reasonably quickly that I needed to be of most valued service, firstly, to my family and loved ones.
Mm.
My husband, who is an emergency physician, who was living this day in and day out and carrying that responsibility very heavily on his shoulders. My children, my 11-year-old triplets, whose world had been turned upside down, and they were, just old enough to ask those very difficult questions.
Mm.
Elderly parents, like many of us. And I actually realized that this was the time for me. I'd spent so much of my life serving others and going to far-flung places in the world and war zones to help other communities and strangers, I guess. And this was now the time for me to step up and serve those closest to me that really needed me. So it was, I see it as a blessing that I was grounded, and that suddenly I had this time on my hands, and that I had a choice to use it well and to actually serve and give to my family. And from there, I have found, new and unexpected and rich purposes and other ways to serve. So, in terms of some human rights work that I've been doing, this period in time has really shone a light on a lot of social injustices and human rights that have been infringed. So I carry on with that work. I've been able to write. I'm very privileged that my voice has a platform in the media, so I've been doing some more commentary work. And surely, slowly but surely, the work has come back again. The work is starting. It looks different. We're all sort of serving and connecting via our screens. But I think also the silver lining is that we're able to access people and places that perhaps we weren't able to before. We're doing it in a way that's kinder to the planet because we're not getting on planes to do it. And the ability to be able to connect and bring people together that perhaps you wouldn't have been able to do so, I think, is an incredible opportunity. Actually, for me, I think the greatest blessing in all of this, the silver lining, is that it has forced us all not just to take stock and to ask those tough questions of ourselves and to look inwardly, but to also take off the masks and not be afraid to show our humanity. So I love hearing the stories of CEOs that are calling meetings with their staff, and the CEO is in t-shirt and shorts, or the female executive that's having their weekly leadership meeting with her team, and the kids are running around in the back. And because that's what we are, we're three-dimensional whole people, and we're actually relating to each other that way now. And the conversations people are having now, we're going right deeply to when we ask each other, how are you? We're listening for the true answer, and we're actually giving each other a real answer now.
It's certainly taken on a different dimension, hasn't it? The how are you certainly here in Australia was a fairly throwaway line. The standard response is, yeah, good, and I'm never sure what that means, whether it's well behaved or healthy.
That's
right. And now, as you say, you tend to get a more straight up and honest response, and people are more interested in the detail, which is great. I'm interested in taking the conversation in probably two directions. So the first is, like you, I've spent a bit of time over this period writing. I'm working on a book called Unshakable, which is about not invulnerability, but the capacity to build a comeback story out of adversity and disruption. And the other part of it is global impact. So I'm really conscious that we're in quite a unique bubble here in Western Australia in terms of the impact of COVID. So it'd be great to get some of your insights there. But on the unshakable theme first, there's a significant attribute to people individually and as leaders and as teams around unshakability, where they're able to very quickly accept and reorient themselves to whatever their reality is. and without sort of being blinkered to the full enormity of it, to take action with some kind of positive mindset about their ability to influence the outcome. Have you got particular tactics that you use personally to do that reorienting? It's I describe these things as moments of impact. There's a point that you know something happens that you're not prepared for, and there's those moments that leave you kind of bobbing in the wake. And it might be literally a couple of seconds while you just go, oh, yep, reorient, or it could be days or months or sometimes even years. Have you got tactics that you use for that reorientation process and kind of getting back to an even keel?
Yeah, and I think, you know, just telling you the story of my Black Friday was probably a good illustration of a recent one. I think for me, it's the questions that I ask myself and the actions that I hold myself to account for. So the COVID one was, you know, what changed my mindset reasonably quickly and allowed me to kind of shift and adopt that, all right, well, this is the reality. How do I go forward now? Was that question, how best can I now serve? And I think that's a trigger. If you can ask, what I have found in my toolkit, if I can ask myself powerful enough questions that serve as a trigger to me changing my mindset, for me, it's about mindset. And your mindset then allows you to make a different choice in terms of how you show up and how you react and how you can adapt and how you can mobilize yourself and others. So for me, it's taking myself out of the center of a crisis and trying to look at, trying to weigh up the macro, but also look at what the next step can be. So asking myself, how can I best serve now in this moment with what has just happened or the change that's just occurred? The other question that I have found that I have needed and have found hugely powerful to ask myself in times of great uncertainty or adversity or crisis is, what can I learn from this? And when I ask myself, what can I learn from this? What I am asking myself is, how do I need to show up in this moment and going forward? And what is the purpose that I must realize now? And that can be a pretty scary question, because it really is having to face who you are. So that's another question that I do ask myself. And in terms of the actions, the most important action, which I never used to be good at, which has probably been only something that I have learned in the last few years, is choosing to ask for help. You know, Brené Brown talks about the power of vulnerability. I was always one of those people that used to keep the guard up and wear the mask and have the shield, because it's scary. It's scary to reveal yourself, to be vulnerable, to be raw. And for me, one of the greatest gifts and learning has been with those that I trust, not being afraid to ask for help and not being afraid to say, I don't know. I don't know the answers to this. This is what I think, or this is what's challenging me. But having a trusted group of people that you feel safe with, to be able to bounce ideas off, to problem solve, like-minded people that can also hold a mirror up to you and hold you to account. Because you need others to challenge your perspectives so that you can then, I guess, be your best self. So
sometimes we get so close to our own, or our own view is so close to us, and it really is genuinely unique, isn't it? It's one of the fascinating things about human experience, I think, is that whole piece of, there is no one on the planet like you. There's no one on the planet like me. And while we might have places where we align, Our point of view really is a very unique product of all of our life experience and what we've learned and how we've been tested and the examples that have been set for us.
Yeah.
So having those close people who are able to call your perspective for what it is and allow you to actually see it, so that it becomes a tool rather than something that you are almost a victim of, I guess.
Absolutely. And questioning those stories that we tell ourselves, because we're all telling ourselves stories.
Yes.
And someone once said to me, you are responsible for your reality. And when I questioned that further, what they were telling me was we're all co-creating our reality. The stories we tell ourselves is what we see. And sometimes we're blinded by those. And those of us that are smart and believe that we have accomplished and achieved, we're the worst for doing numbers on ourselves. Because we're so good at convincing ourselves of our particular perspectives and stories. And that's where being able to call upon those resources of others that you trust, that can hold a mirror up, that can challenge your views, is just crucial. And having the humility and the grace to be able to receive that.
There's an interesting paradox here, I think, isn't there? That for me, the most unshakable people I know manage to hold a really active tension between an almost unrealistic sense of self-confidence and ability to back yourself in action, alongside a humility that really clearly acknowledges I've got so much to learn. And those things seem to be at odds with each other at a superficial glance. But when you get that balance right, it's a really powerful paradox to be able to hang on to.
Very well said. And I think, from speaking personally, that thing that you describe as self-confidence is having, for me, it's having great clarity in my purpose and who I am and what my values are.
Yeah.
And committing to living those values.
So do you want to speak a little bit to that? Because I think COVID's been interesting in that, when it first broke, part of the reason for this webcast, for me starting this, was I saw a lot of people who were very actively using fear as a tool to try and get sometimes quite unethical results from people. There was lots of people who were acting in very twitchy and fearful ways because of their circumstances. As you've described, many of us were directly experiencing various levels of financial duress and uncertainty, and so people were doing stuff there that was kind of quite seemingly out of character for them. And I agree with you. I think that connection to purpose is quite significant. So and it's that level of clarity kind of needs to be built outside of pressure. If you're trying to make it happen in a moment of pressure, it's pretty unlikely. So how do you build that clarity for yourself? And I know that's also work that you do with some of your clients too.
I've used this expression earlier. I think it is choosing to look from within and reflecting back on whence you've come from. What has made you who you are, what to this point has driven you, has informed and influenced your choices and decisions in life, the values that you hold dear, and actually making a conscious decision that despite all the noise that's going around, you will stay true to that. And having those other people that will hold you to account for that. And I think it is being able to sit with that in a way that allows you to just take a step back, take a breath. As I said, quieten all the noise and live true to yourself. I guess, when you were talking about what you were saying in terms of people's immediate reactions, I saw that very clearly, in what we do in our industry. Suddenly there was a whole lot of people that were flooding the marketplace that were now crisis leaders, crisis leadership
Yeah.
experts, offering all sorts of courses that clearly had been cobbled together very quickly for rock bottom price or for free. And initially, the insecure part of me, the panicky child in me, thought, well, I need to be out there. I need to get my voice out there. And actually, I realized the more I saw this flooding of the market, the more I realized I needed to retreat back, because this was not a space that I wanted to play in, that I wanted to inhabit. I could feel the desperation. It was palpable. And so I decided just to slow down, to take a step back, to go back to what was true and authentic, and to just hunker down and serve those that I had already served, and to continue to build relationships with those that I had built some good faith with. And that felt right and true and genuine. It wasn't the time to be touting for new business or selling the latest course to those that were desperate and were willing to grab at anything. This was the time to actually just reach out to those that I had relationships with and offer without an expectation for anything in return, because actually this was about connectivity. We're all going through this. How can we help each other? So yeah, and I guess that's what that inner change comes from. When we go through these huge shifts and these huge changes and crises, it really is an opportunity for all of us to stop and reflect, and to ask ourselves whether it's time to shift the compass back and have a bit of a reset.
Yeah, I like to loop back to your earlier question about how can I serve. I think the value of that as well is that it shifts the focus to an external focus and an action-oriented focus. So, I know for myself, when I'm in a victim state, which is often what happens in those moments of impact, it's very easy to get into that sort of condition of why is this happening to me, and feeling helpless. And being able to shift to an external point of view and shift to some sort of sense of agency in a situation is incredibly powerful. And I think your questions really help you to do that mentally. It's really quite significant. What about the global scene, Rabia? So a number of people who've been tuning into these conversations over time are saying, there's been a lot that we've spoken about in terms of leadership impacts here, particularly in the Australian context, but a little bit globally. There's been quite a bit said in terms of thinking and philosophy and resilience and that kind of territory. And a few people have said, I think very astutely, that the experience for different people in different parts of the world is significantly different. I can't remember who said it, but there was a great quote probably about a month ago now where somebody said, we're all in the same boat with COVID. And the response was, we're in the same storm, but we're in very different boats. So I'm just interested in your point of view, given that you've worked and traveled globally quite significantly and done a lot of work with not-for-profits and organisations, both government and private sector, that are about supporting people who are in less privileged positions than what we are here. How are you seeing the impact of COVID rolling out in other parts of the globe, and how can we be aware of and supportive of that from our quiet little bubble here in WA?
I alluded to one of the observations that I've made before, and that is that this pandemic has really shone a light on the social inequities that exist around the globe and even within our country. It's very plain for us to see that poverty is playing a huge role. Basic necessities that some people don't have is literally killing communities. Those that don't have access to basic health care, those that live in parts of the world where they can't afford quarantine, that's the foreign concept, because they can't afford to stop and isolate, because they'll starve if they do. You talk about leadership. Isn't it so interesting that never more starkly have we witnessed the dire consequences of poor leadership? You know, you only have to look at Brazil or what's been happening and unfolding in the United States. When you have leaders that have used fear and division and othering and greed and narcissism as the motivators for their power, you're seeing leaders that are not serving their community, and so they've abandoned their community and things have fallen apart. There's been no preparation, there's been no proper response, and the people that they're supposed to be serving, they've forsaken, and it's literally costing lives. You know, the collateral damage in terms of human sacrifice is just mounting. You know, you look at what's happening in India and the sheer numbers of people that are dying there. You really are starkly reminded that in countries like that, with populations and poverty in terms that we can barely conceive, that I've got firsthand experience of, life does not have the same value. And lives are not protected to the same level or cherished as we're blessed to experience that. And then you look in our own backyard and you see, you know, the vulnerable communities here that, thank goodness, so far, touch wood, we've been able to protect. But, you know, our Indigenous communities and remote communities, refugees and asylum seekers, so vulnerable to this. And I think one of the other inequities that is becoming more and more obvious that we're talking more about now is playing out in this gender divide, where women, there's been so much research done, and you know, there is evidence that demonstrates that women have been overrepresented in terms of the impact, the social and economic impact of COVID. You know, domestic violence, in the young, the suicide rates. So it's really interesting that we are dealing with, on the face of it, a health crisis. But actually, what I think for years to come, for generations to come, what we're going to be grappling with, and the challenge in order to really address and see if we can think of solutions or ways of preventing further harm, is in the social injustices, is addressing poverty, is actually recognizing that leadership plays a fundamental and direct part in terms of safeguarding a nation. And I think also the mental health crisis that's going to come from this. Everybody's talking about the mental health pandemic. You know, the things that we're not dealing with now on the front line as an immediate response, but domestic violence, relationship breakdown, and mental illness is something that's going to be the ongoing pandemic, I think. But yeah, it's for those of us that have had the privilege of working in parts of the world where we've seen the best of humanity and the worst of humanity, and great poverty and suffering. For a lot of these communities, every day is COVID. And I think that we have to try and appreciate it and get some perspective from it. And we might say over here in Australia, we can't do anything. At the moment, we're very focused about keeping our borders and our nations and even our states protected. We're going to be living with this for a long time to come. We don't know when a vaccine is going to come, and that's not going to be the panacea. I think there is an incredible opportunity to look at the fact that you know, the world's been screaming out for ages and we just haven't been listening. finally we are being shown that there is something that impacts us all, that connects us all. And I think that the challenge for us and the opportunity for us is to wake up, to understand that my actions affect your life, and your actions will have a ripple effect and an impact on me. And we are all therefore interconnected, and we can all play a part in bringing about change. And we can do that in ways where, yes, we can be of service, we can give, we can also hold our leaders and those in power that make these decisions about our communities and our welfare and our social structures. We can hold them to account, and we can demand better, but we can actually bring about a lot of the change as well. You said you were writing your book, Unshakable. The second book that I'm writing, the working title is A Beautiful Revolution. And it's focusing on the fact that now more than ever, because we find ourselves in an era of perceived helplessness, where we can't just look to our leaders to solve the problems, we are mobilizing as people. We are finally realizing that we can come together as communities to bring about huge change. And we're seeing it in the movements, in the social movements, where we're shining a light, and people, ordinary people like you and I, are saying no more. Things have to change, and we're going to be the change.
I think it comes back a lot to what you were saying earlier about leadership, Rabia. There's having worked in the space of survival instructing for a number of years, you can see that there's a distinct choice, not always conscious, that happens whenever there's a moment of pressure. And one is that there's an immediate, almost reactive desire to look after yourself. And I think what you're saying there, Doug, about, if you're not able to service even basic needs for survival, it's pretty difficult to think beyond that, and probably unrealistic. And then if you couple that with leadership that's not kind of steadying the ship, then that just pours more fuel on the fire. So we're seeing that in a few places around the world. So I reckon that choice is, it's really for all of us to make. We saw glimmers of this in Australia, where with the whole toilet paper craziness that was going on, everybody, people literally panic buying half a house worth of toilet paper, and there's zero logic for that. It is probably the lowest thing I could think of in the list of things to ensure my survival. But it's also quite compelling when you're in a place where it feels like there's a shortage of something, and that's the kind of energy that you're surrounded with. It takes significant effort to swim against the tide. For me, I don't know about your thoughts, Rabia, but for me, this is a combination effort. It's a combination of people who can think differently and have the capacity and space to do that, to do it responsibly and to act. It's, as you said, holding leaders to account, and it's starting different kinds of conversations globally. One of my hopes out of COVID is that kind of appreciation that there is a connection between all of us on this big planet that we sit on, will actually hold a little bit more weight than it perhaps has in the past. But I guess the jury's still out on that.
Yes, that's my hope as well. And I think also a willingness for us all to find that common ground as the starting point. Doug was asking about how we reach these people. And I think it is about finding that common ground and being able to articulate, you may seem very different to me and our circumstances are very different. But I absolutely believe that at a fundamental level, there is more that binds us than separates us as human beings. And it's being able to tap into that and express that, articulate that in a way where you can start a conversation. I think that's the challenge for those of us that have the privilege of being able to serve and educate and influence.
Rabia, thanks very much for your time. That's got us to our 40 minutes. So it's a conversation that's a deep and a rich one, and we could dive into in a heap of detail. There's so much complexity in all of this, and certainly we are in a very, very fortunate position here in Perth, for which I for one, am very grateful. I appreciate your time. If people are looking for you to do more with you, or find out more about your story, or get copies of books, etc., where can they find you?
Sure. Well, probably the best port of call is to jump onto my website, which is rabiasiddique.com. My book, Equal Justice, can be ordered on there if they want to know more, if anyone wants to know more about the story and the lessons that I've learned from my stories. And yeah, I just continue to be of service if anyone thinks that I can be of help, whether it be sort of, as an inspirational speaker, or as a mentor, or facilitating workshops, particularly in this time around leading through adversity and resilience, and recognizing the importance of diversity, which is really important in this time as well. Then I'd love to hear from them. So yeah.
Great. Thanks very much, Rabia, and thank you for your continued service to people around the planet in various ways. We look forward to watching how the story unfolds.
Thank you, and to you. Thanks everyone for joining.